I'm joined today by Lisa Quest, who's managing partner of UK and Ireland for Oliver Wyman.
Recognize that giving critical feedback isn't going to drive women away. It's going to make them kind of better and able to then perform at the top level.
A lot of people, particularly again, looking at graduates, have huge ambitions, but they doubt that they're good enough or that they could do it. Have you ever had moments when you've doubted yourself?
If you are putting yourself in consistently challenging situations, you should and will always be doubting yourself.
I'm joined today by Lisa Quest, who's managing partner of UK and Ireland for Oliver Wyman. Good afternoon, Lisa. How are you doing?
I'm great, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, not at all. Thanks for coming down. I'm particularly interested in your story from when you started out your career to today, as much as you can go into that.
Well, thanks, James. So like many advisors, I started my career in consulting directly out of university. I went to university in Canada and I started my career in our New York office. And from there, my focus was largely in financial services. So I did advisory for a number of years. I actually left for a period of time and I was an investor with a private capital fund. And then I came back into advisory and I've since worked largely in the public sector. In addition to working in the public sector for Oliver Wyman, I'm also a visiting academic fellow with the London School of Economics, which is where I did my master's work. And I sit on a number of boards, including the UK and Canada Chamber of Commerce. So I've got a nice little portfolio career going now.
And what's changing in consulting? You tapped in a little bit there about how the firm is adapting in the face of Gen AI, and I suppose the Gen AI revolutions that we're seeing. What to you are the big themes of the day?
So I'd separate it into two different categories. I think the first theme is around the type of advice that our clients expect. And I think clients are increasingly putting a higher and higher bar on what they expect from their advisors. So blue sky strategy thinking, they're not really in the market for it anymore, right? They want to understand from first principles, what is the impact, not just on their company, but on the ecosystems within which they operate domestically, how that interplays with kind of international geopolitics. And they really want you to understand not just the first order impacts, but the second and the third, and how you would actually implement that with them, right? So it's much more hands-on, much more tailored advisory services that our clients are looking for. And then in terms of the more technology shifts, obviously Gen AI hasn't come in at scale, but we have an internal, we call him Len AI. We have an internal proprietary Gen AI system, which has started doing a lot of the basic research and benchmarking and analytics that we would have expected our first and second year analyst to undertake. So it's starting to really increase the productivity of the individuals that we have, especially at that junior level. And it's changing the skill set and profile. So no longer do you just need to be kind of a researcher or an analyst. You need to be actually able to consume that information and drive kind of convergence around more complex problems using that as an input. So it's really an exciting time.
I think a lot of questions that I think young consultants and people at large have about this technology is how is it going to shift the industry, jobs at large, but also therefore what skills should young graduates and young consultants be thinking about if they want to be, useful in the consulting world of tomorrow, or just more broadly in the sort of, kind of corporate ecosystem? What are the skills you think are going to be relevant?
So we've actually just undertaken a piece of research with the Oliver Wyman Forum, which is the think tank that sits alongside our commercial operations, and interviewed 17,000 individuals who contributed to the survey, which was on the impact of Gen AI for professional services more broadly, but obviously consulting sits within that. And the initial kind of expectation is that Gen AI and other technologies will dramatically improve the productivity of individuals in the role before they fundamentally shift kind of the numbers within the workforce.
Yes.
But when we interview individuals to come into the firm, and I know what many of the other strategy advisory firms look like, is they're looking for individuals who have group problem-solving capabilities that are able to drive convergence amongst kind of multiple stakeholders with differing views, and to really maximize kind of what we would call the HI, the human intelligence elements of the job, right? So it's less and less around can you grind through a series of benchmarks or can you compile a lot of data into one place, but can you put kind of the cognitive human intelligence on top of that helps you understand kind of how that data informs solving complex problems for our clients and then working within a group to actually help them land those impacts.
And in the context of that then, what about business leaders when it comes to Gen AI specifically over the next 5 years, you mentioned there that a lot of this is yet to come into fruition the way we think it will. What should they be thinking about at this moment in the context of generative AI? And I appreciate it's quite a broad question, but just some broad ideas maybe.
I think when you're thinking about it in the context of how do you bring it into the business, you need to think about what does the resource profile look like as you're scaling up kind of the use of Gen AI versus down kind of individual analysts that will be using it. But I think as you're thinking about it in the instance of individual application, and I'll quote this because it was one of the best ones I've heard, but we had the woman who led President Biden's executive order on AI. And basically what she said was that Gen AI is like an Ivy League grad. Right 90% of the time, wrong 10% of the time, 100% confident, right? So basically, in individual instances, you just need to learn how to interrogate the AI. And actually, you could talk to it like a question, right? So it will give you an answer, and then you have to come back to it and say, well, how sure are you in that answer? What was your source information? What are the potential biases in your answers? Like, what are the different kind of versions of the answer? And you have to learn how to interrogate AI like you would work with your junior analyst, right? It has all the information, but it doesn't yet know how to put it in the context of the problem you're trying to solve.
And then thinking about that and how we use this technology responsibly, I know there's a lot of talk at governments developing regulatory frameworks. And again, I know this is quite early on in this discussion, but what kind of things would you be advising your clients in those spaces on how to use this safely, responsibly, and for the good of everyone?
So we've been quite involved as a firm in the development of AI regulation in both the US, across Europe, as well as some of the emerging regulatory frameworks in Asia as well. What we're looking at is what are the end harms to consumers that we are potentially trying to mitigate with that regulatory framework? What is the potential for AI to improve productivity? How do you balance the competing demands for competition and individual data privacy? And what does that look like kind of for a holistic national and then international regulatory framework? And that's on the kind of government and regulatory side. Yeah. And then on the private sector side, similarly to how we're thinking about, use of AI in financial services or in energy, you're looking at both the revenue and the cost side of the equation. So where on the revenue side can we be thinking about better targeted segmentation, interface through bots or AI for consumer kind of relations? And then, obviously there's huge opportunities on the cost side, especially in risk and compliance heavy sectors where you can automate through AI some of the basic processes that are done within those functions. And actually what you can end up with there is a much more efficient organization, but also more effective because you take the opportunity for human error out of that as well. That could potentially result in very large shifts in the workforce, right? So alongside all of the technology implementation, we're also working with government and business on what do tertiary education programs look like, who is responsible for that between business, government, individuals, and how do we start thinking now about what are the skills required for the future so that we don't kind of back ourselves into a situation where tens of thousands of people are shifted from one sector to the other without having the right skills and education.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's vital. What challenges have you faced specifically as a female leader and just throughout your career? Have there been instances where perhaps, different treatment to sort of male colleagues?
It's one that I reflect on often, right? And it is one that I'm often asked. I think throughout my career, I've been incredibly lucky to have really talented and amazing sponsors who have all happened to be male because of the nature of the industry. I've joined, almost 20 years ago, and leadership at that time just was male. And so I was really lucky from an early age in my career to have quite strong sponsors who pulled me up through the company. But there were just some structural things along the way that because we lived in a firm that was designed by men, it just wasn't as accommodating for some of the kind of life events that are unique to women. And, I remember when I was going through my partner promotion case, we had just policies that I had to take a mat leave that year because that was the year I was having my first child. And we had policies that didn't really flex to individuals that had to be off for a period of time. And so I think as a woman, you encounter these things and, they are just inherently different for you because I was the first person that had ever had a baby in the year that I'd been promoted to partner. And it's just helping the firm break those down. And I think if you don't have sponsors that you can kind of go to help you break down those barriers, it's really difficult. And you need to kind of cultivate and develop those relationships. So I think that's a big part of it. And then even when you operate in any firm kind of as one of the only kind of senior women kind of coming up through, there's just a bit more of a female tax. And I think just helping the firm understand and recognize where you're being pulled away and having kind of more time spent on mentoring more people coming up or speaking engagements or doing other things because you're simply one of the only women, then I think that's where you start to kind of just see a bit more of time being spent there. So there's different experiences, but I think for the most part, I've been really kind of positively surprised on the upside that I've been treated very similarly to everyone else.
What can business leaders, not specifically within Oliver Wyman, but more broadly, be doing to promote women up into senior leadership positions? Because it's something we see a lot. We see really talented women, junior, mid-ranks in consulting firms and financial institutions. But one of the main challenges is when you look at the diversity ratio at the sort of top table of a lot of companies, that really starts to fall down. What are the barriers, do you think, to reaching the sort of most senior echelons for women, and what can business leaders be thinking about to sort of change the dynamic?
I think the most obvious is sponsorship and making sure that you're sponsoring across gender lines and making sure that that sponsorship includes helping those women understand what makes a successful business leader, right? There are certain types of roles, particularly those in P&L lines that lead to you sitting at that top table. And I think too often women kind of will leave those as part of kind of a mid-career break, or they'll not kind of necessarily have the right sponsorship to kind of get them up and through. So that's one internally, is like sponsorship and making sure that that sponsorship is focused on helping them through the ranks in a way that will help lead to getting them at the top table. I think the second is engaging effectively with external bodies. So you have the 30% Club. There's a lot of kind of individual kind of organizations now that help promote and sponsor women up to kind of particularly at the board level. So making sure your company is engaged with those elements as well. And then the third is, make it personal, right? And don't be afraid to give challenging feedback to women. Yes. I think one of the things I've noticed along my career, especially with kind of male leaders who want to support women, that almost makes them shy away from giving the critical feedback that those women need in order to be able to succeed. So recognize that giving critical feedback isn't going to drive women away. It's going to make them kind of better and able to then perform at the top level. And so thinking about in the same way that you would give feedback to a high-performing kind of male sponsee, do the same to the women. They won't fall apart.
What advice would you have for those individuals looking to progress themselves, and specifically thinking back to your own career, things you might have done differently in hindsight? What would you say to your younger self?
I think I would have done a lot of things differently.
Oh, really?
Who knows? I mean, I had such a wandering career. I always describe it like a cat wandering in the woods. What would I have done differently? I think one of the things that I liked about the career that I had was that I, from an early age, identified kind of individuals at a senior level that I just liked their values, and I liked the impact that they had with clients, and I liked the way that they engaged with teams. And I joke with one of the guys who's been my sponsor at my whole career, but I basically just stalked him down and made him my sponsor. And I think don't be afraid to find people that inspire you, tell them that they inspire you, and then find a way to work with them, right? In a good sponsor-sponsee relationship, you're benefiting them as much as they're benefiting you, right? You're working on projects with them, you're helping them deliver, you're providing them perspective from the firm. So know the value that you have to them as well, and be purposeful about developing and cultivating the relationships that you want. And then the second is, and I definitely didn't do this one, but look at where you want to be and then almost consciously backtrack from that. So, you want to be the CFO. Okay, backtrack. What did the CFO do for 5 years before they were the CFO? What did they do 5 years before that? And make sure that you're kind of looking 2 or 3 plays ahead to put the right groundwork in now. Because too often people get to a point in their career and they're like, actually, whoa, I want to be that guy. You're like, oh, cool, but you have done nothing that was required to be that guy. So that's going to be either set you back 10 years or you have to go and be the guy that you've been training to be. And so I think just be a bit more purposeful about that and look 2 or 3 plays ahead as well.
Where does someone find a mentor then? Say, they're not in a really large organization yet, they're a graduate, they're a bit intimidated by approaching senior people. What advice do you have to them?
So there's always in large organizations, there's always classic mentorship programs. I actually don't really value those that much because a mentor-mentee relationship or a sponsor-sponsee relationship it's a relationship like anyone else, right? So somebody can say, hey, you're going to be this person's mentor. But if you don't have a vibe with them, that's not going to work, right? Or if you're not in the same area, it's not going to work. So I think find people who you genuinely have similar values or you genuinely like their impact. And then, know your own worth, right? Like it is probably the case that they want to get to know you. And so if you're feeling kind of shy about that, if you're feeling not confident about your own value, sit down and write it down. What are the 3 best things that you could provide to this person? So you could provide them perspective on what it's like to be a new grad. You could, support them in some of the work that they're trying to achieve. You could do something else based on a skill that you have. And just give yourself the confidence that you could do that. And then find a way to approach them in, a way that's authentic to you. So maybe you're not comfortable walking up to that person in the office, but you are comfortable sending them an email, laying out what you admire about the way that they work and how you think you could kind of work well together, and create the kind of opportunity as a mutual benefit as opposed to just them doing something for you.
Were the things sponsors that you had or mentors gave to you that you weren't necessarily looking for? Were there certain traits or experiences that you got out of that interaction that maybe you just didn't even occur to you would be an opportunity?
Yeah, the best things they've given me are the ones that I either wasn't looking for or didn't feel that I needed, right? The first is tough love. Like they genuinely at critical points in my career said, you are not doing this well enough, or you need to do that better, or you need to, be networked into here. And they gave me advice that was probably difficult for them to say. It was certainly difficult for me to hear. But they did it in a way where I felt supported, and they created those stretch opportunities, but I knew they were always there, right, to catch me. So they'd say, you're going to go lead this big assignment. And that was like terrifying, right? But you knew that they were there to help if you needed. And it was like phone a friend. So they created those kind of opportunities. I think they also unblocked things. Yeah. It's what your sponsors do in the rooms you're not in that actually is what matters. And there were a number of things that happened throughout my career, either roles that I got or positions that I ended up in. And they never, ever said that they were the reason that I was in that room. But you can see their fingerprints on it when you look back and you're like, oh yeah, no, this is why. And then the third one is they also helped me see those 2 or 3 plays ahead. And so instead of just me kind of blindly charging like a bull that I can be sometimes, they said, well, actually, like, be more purposeful, slow down. What are you trying to achieve? And then what are the 2 or 3 roles or experiences or skills that you need now in order to be in that room in 5 years? And it was just those things. So it's quite targeted. And that's why I said it's like a relationship. Yeah. And it's not just a general kind of matching program where you meet somebody once a quarter for a coffee.
Yeah, I think that's priceless advice and something that's really overlooked by young consultants. Yeah. Tough love, why is that important?
It's just development, right? And it's so important because I think it's really hard to give and sometimes it's hard to receive. But if you can have that level of trust in the relationship, like those are the moments when you grow, right? You don't grow when you're just like doing your regular job day to day. You grow when you're in a difficult situation and you have to either rise to it, or you're in a difficult situation and you failed and you have to pick yourself back up from it. And like the times I've grown the most in my career are exactly those moments. And in both those, in each of those situations, there's been times when I've risen and knocked it out of the park, and there's been times when I've fallen flat on my ass. And that's where you learn, right?
A lot of people, particularly, again, looking at graduates, have huge ambitions to come into the world of finance, come into the world of consulting, but they doubt that they're good enough or that they could do it, even though quite often they're very credible candidates for the roles. Have you ever had moments when you've doubted yourself? And if so, how do you overcome that?
Yes. I mean, I think we all have moments where we doubt ourselves, and we doubt ourselves probably in the extreme. And, people I think often very loosely throw around the term imposter syndrome. I don't love imposter syndrome because I think it's a bit of a cop-out in many, many ways. But I think if you are putting yourself in consistently challenging situations, you should and will always be doubting yourself. It would be very strange to undertake a challenging career or to undertake a challenging role without doubting yourself. And so what I do when I'm in those situations where I think, God, I honestly don't know how I'm going to do this, you just step back and you think, what are the actual skills that I have, right? So I'm being put in this situation because somebody thinks that I can do this, or I'm considered in a pool of candidates to be able to even apply for a particular type of role because I have some sort of qualifications, and actually write down, like, why are you in that room, right? What are the potential things that you have within yourself that qualify you to be in that room? And then write down what the things are that you think you're missing, right? And so what are you missing? And then challenge yourself, like, am I actually missing it? Or am I just worried that I'm missing it? And then just practice, right? So look at what the skills are that are required for the job, have discussions with friends, have discussions with mentors, try to cultivate a friend group that is kind of multi-generational. So the best thing that I did early on is I just got friends that were of all different ages. And that really helped, because when I wanted to have a bit better perspective, I'd go to one of my friends who was like 10, 15 years older and just kind of get their perspective on, what they were thinking at that time and how they think about kind of the skill sets, and, cultivate a different group of opinions. Yeah. And then you get that confidence in yourself to go for it. And I think sometimes you have to be comfortable putting yourself out on a ledge and being comfortable that you might fail and you might publicly fail, and that's okay.
For you, what does success look like, and also failure? And I think we can't just build on this, but what structures or strategies do you have for dealing with failure?
So success to me looks like having a productive and high impact team. I think success for me individually is almost success secondarily for kind of the success of the team. And I think any business leader should be thinking about their own personal success as a second order impact to having a successful, growing, productive, and happy team. Failure, I think, is a natural part of everything that we do. And I think, it is okay to fail. You shouldn't be failing at the same thing consistently. That is definitely not okay. But you need to understand and incorporate how you think about and incorporate failure into your own personal and then also your organizational feedback mechanism.
Yes.
So as an advisor, you bid for work all the time. You don't win all of the work that you bid for. I have a personal problem with this because literally every single time that I'm in a pitch, I'm convinced that we won it. So it's a separate issue that I'm personally dealing with, but we can get into that. But you have to be able to understand, like, what is the after action review that you're going to do for everything that you won and didn't win? How are you going to incorporate that feedback into the next one such that, you will still lose in the future, but how are you gradually increasing your win rate? And so both kind of at an organizational level and at an individual level, recognize that it's going to happen and figure out how to get better for the next one.
What motivates you? What is it that has driven you during your career?
I think what personally motivates me is the idea that you can have an impact well beyond yourself. So the reason I went into government advisory is because you could have an impact at a national level that can lead to policies that improve financial inclusion, that improve literacy, that improve numeracy. And you can then multiply the impact that you could have on your kind of own personal life through to the lives of, tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And that's really, really exciting, right? And that you can get on the government side that you genuinely can't get anywhere else. My pitch internally, whenever people are considering which, teams to align to, I say, well, do you want to impact, the course of a country, or do you want to impact, the strategy of an organization? Yeah. Which is, and many people, decide which way they want to go on that. Yeah. But I think, so that's what motivates me kind of on a personal level. And then, on a personal / professional level, however you want to think about it, the thing that gives me the greatest satisfaction is like when you watch your team, especially somebody that you worked really close with, do something that they previously thought they couldn't do. So whether it was, an advisory, or whether it's a public speaking thing, or whether it's, them just training their teams in a way that like you're, promoting kind of the next generation, like that's super exciting. And you watch that happen and you're like, yeah, that is like multiplying the effect of you in through the organization. And you can see them just derive so much satisfaction from that. And like the secondary satisfaction of that is the best. Yeah, that's the best thing.
And for people who aren't so close to it, what advice do you give to government? How does that work? What are governments of countries coming to Oliver Wyman for in terms of advice?
So government typically come for advice in a number of areas. I mean, one is on kind of next generation technologies, next generation digitalization, how they should be thinking about their organizational design, and, effectiveness of government or government excellence. So how do we kind of deliver services as a government in a way that is, better than we have previously? How do we help more people? And, that's a big area of focus for us, is helping governments be more effective in their delivery of government services. And oftentimes they're interested in, what are other countries doing? How have others approached this? How have others thought about it for these different sectors? And it's something that advisors can uniquely provide, because in government, you tend to be more focused within kind of your own national arena, because that's where you play. And you don't have a lot of time to kind of pop your head up and say, what are other countries doing? What can I learn from that? So that's one. The second is technical areas of policy development. So government has, some of the best and most talented minds in the world, but they don't have all of the deep specialist expertise because they don't need it on an ongoing basis. So sometimes it makes sense for governments to buy in, specific expertise on sanctions, or specific expertise on Gen AI, or specific expertise on quantum, because they don't need to have that expertise in-house all the time. And so some of what we do is on kind of technical policy development. And then probably the third area where we do a lot of advisory with government as well is the public-private partnership. And how do we help convene government and private sector? You saw this through the likes of kind of COVID financial support, where that was enacted through the financial services sector. You can see this sometimes again in AI, where you're looking at policy across kind of government and private sector to help shape the regulatory agenda. And there's a lot of areas in that kind of public-private intersection where advisory firms can play a really important role.
Do you see that becoming more prevalent moving forwards, the public-private?
I do. I think particularly following COVID and the kind of the interwoven nature of public and private sector service delivery for citizens is only going to increase, in my view. I mean, the government needs to rely on private sector to enable and enact many of the policies that it develops. And we're increasingly kind of working across that dimension.
What pressures come with the responsibility of being in a senior leadership position, and how do you cope with those?
Yeah, there are a lot of pressures that come with being in a senior leadership position, just given the sheer size of the organization. So every step that I took on my leadership journey, I'm a very tribal person. So I always thought that I cared about the team that I was in, and I cared about them very deeply because that was the team that I had kind of grown up in. And as I've taken more steps out on my leadership journey and that team has gotten bigger, what surprised me was that I cared about the bigger team as much as I cared about that smaller team. And I think the emotional toll on that was something I wasn't expecting. Yes. So when I took over as kind of the market leader last year, I wasn't expecting to kind of have such an emotional kind of carry for the whole firm in the way that I did for kind of just the public sector team. So that was a surprise. And I think that then kind of led me to just kind of feeling a little bit more kind of that emotional kind of carry on an ongoing basis. And then, the other areas are the diversity of the decisions you have to make. So as you become a leader, become a more senior leader, the diversity of the decisions you have to make now cover the full spectrum of the business, as well as the full spectrum of clients that we serve. And switching between those decisions and the cognitive load of that has been an interesting kind of transition for me. But the biggest thing that enables all of that is, recognizing that being a leader is actually about surrounding yourself with a capable team of leaders. And so one of the first things that I always look at when I kind of take on new leadership positions is, what is the right kind of configuration of senior leaders to put around me that augment and kind of help with the kind of limitations that I have and I know. So one of the things about me personally is I'm very quick to make decisions. Some might call me impulsive, but I like to make decisions very quickly. So one of the things I have to consciously do is surround myself with individuals who make decisions slowly. And so not for all decisions, but for areas where they genuinely feel like more thought is required. Like we have the discussion ex ante to say, this is my personality. Like one of your specific roles here is to help slow us down where you think decisions are being made too quickly. And so we have that honest conversation to say, listen, this is one where you just need to pump the brakes. And actually you need to just wait and we need to make the decision slower. And to surround yourself with that trusted group of leaders where you've had the ex ante honest conversation about what you're good at and what you're not good at, I think is the best way to mitigate kind of the kind of limitations on the mental load.
You made a really interesting point there about sometimes getting sucked in emotionally to the business. I think that's something a lot of leaders some struggle with. Any advice on how you've found ways to not get too, personally involved in business critical matters, people around you, but say, in your day-to-day way of operating, are there any sort of tricks or I don't know, techniques that you employ to not suffer from that?
I mean, I think it comes back to getting the right group of leaders around you, right? So knowing who are your people on which thing and trusting them to do their job, right? And to make sure that they will pull you in if they need you, but to try to stay as arm's length as you can from the decisions that you've delegated, right? So understand where you put the delegation in place and just allow that to process and like stop yourself from meddling just because you can see it and you can think of a different way. The only way to really create the capacity is actually then to have the teams in place. We talk about this a lot, actually, because you have that also on projects as well. And like you need to be comfortable delegating decisions down into the team in order to create the capacity for yourself to focus on mission critical things. And then I think one of the best ways that I have for not taking that home is I have a 4-year-old and I have a 6-year-old boy, and they are full on. So I walk in the door and I am hit with a whole lot of child. And it's different. So we've got this place at the door where we leave our phones. I don't have my phone when I'm with my kids because I don't want to be on my phone when I'm with my kids. And we just have this like little box that sits at the door. And so when we're home, you're with them and they're full on and they're Monopoly and they're cards and it's Unos and like there's literally nothing else you can think of. So that's kind of that's how I kind of separate.
I know a lot of, I've been reading a lot of the stuff that you've done since been management is quite progressive around work-life balance. And I think it's essential because so many of the conversations we now have with consultants, one of the trepidations they have about getting into a consulting career is exactly that. You've obviously found some innovative ways to separate, but more broadly, do you have any other advice for young consultants looking for that separation between work and home life? And interestingly, have you employed any of those in the business yet?
Yeah, so we do quite a lot of it at Oliver Wyman in terms of employing kind of techniques to just make sure that our teams switch off when they're meant to be off. I think the first is like find something that's authentic to you. So I'm Canadian, obviously, and we go to Canada every August. So I take kind of more vacation or I'm off out of the office, but then I work lightly on it. And like that's a technique that works really well for me. I have very strict rules around kind of 8 to 6, and I have quite good boundaries within that. And my teams kind of get to know that, and we work together on that, and we have a lot of conversations. We call them way we work conversations around kind of what preferences people have. I really encourage people to keep up outside hobbies. I think one of the most important things is, even when you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed and tired, like you need to find time for the things that give you energy. Yes. And it's actually not just sleep that gives you energy, right? It's doing something that you love that gives you energy. So if you love yoga or if you love reading or if you love running or whatever it is, that is what you need to find time for, and not just kind of clocking off and like logging onto Netflix and kind of sleeping. So I think make sure that you take the time for that. And you got to find kind of what works for you. And so we basically just kind of encourage people to find their own paths and to be honest and open about it. Because what works for me isn't going to be what works for somebody else. But I always smile a bit when people say that consulting isn't a career that gives you flexibility, because I actually think of all of the careers that I've looked at, and I kind of actively think every single year, like if I wasn't a consultant, like what would I want to go and do? And look actively and talk to people in my network about different jobs. This is the only one that gives me the flexibility I need to have right now as a mother. So I find it really fascinating, particularly when I have this conversation with women, that they say, oh, I feel like it's incompatible with being a parent. And honestly, I think it's the only one that's compatible with my style of parenting anyway at the moment.
I think that, would surprise a lot of people who don't know more about it. And for you, obviously you're very busy with the job, with the boys. What do you like to find time for when you outside of that?
So outside of that, I love swimming and I love rock climbing. So we've basically co-opted our children into having the same hobbies as us, which is great. So every Sunday morning we go rock climbing as a family, which is fantastic. And we do a lot outside. And we do a lot of swimming. We do a lot of climbing, a lot of just walking outside, mostly because like the children have an unbelievable amount of energy. And I feel like puppies, I'm just kind of running them in the park.
We've spoken a lot about Gen AI and just thinking about trends more broadly in consulting. Are there others that you are seeing right now? Are there other sort of hot topics that are coming up over the next couple of years that business leaders really need to be thinking about?
I think climate and sustainability remains a hot topic. So not just in our advisory, but how as an industry are we supporting the climate and sustainability agenda? Particularly with respect to kind of the kind of more pre-COVID, but the consultant and Monday to Thursday on site at clients. There's a lot of air travel in that. What is the best way for like the industry to support climate and sustainability initiatives from our own perspective? How are we doing that from an advisory perspective? Diversity and inclusion, not just gender diversity, but, all forms of diversity, and particularly an increasing form of diversity and kind of socioeconomic diversity. Yes. And how are we promoting that through the advisory services? And then obviously all of the new technologies. So I think we do feel like there are some quite fundamental shifts to the business model that are coming up that will not only impact, the advisory model and how we are internally structured, but also how our clients are structured. And I think Gen AI is a great example of that.
And how do you see those roles changing then, if we assume that Gen AI isn't going to be displacing jobs in advisory or otherwise, but it's going to be complementary? How is that shift going to manifest itself? What should people be thinking about?
So I view it as a spectrum. I think initially it will just be increasing the productivity, but I do think that eventually it will have a shift in the number of roles. And so I think what we will be expecting people to do is shift again towards much more of the human intelligence elements that I was talking about. So how are we problem solving within groups of individuals? How do we think about convergence amongst, different stakeholders who aren't acting in a 100% rational way, but actually act the way that humans do, which is, with their own irrationalities and their own political motivations? And how do you use your kind of human capabilities to sit in a room and drive convergence amongst, people who have very different ideas of what good looks like? And then how do you also interpret the data and even the intelligence that the Gen AI is giving you to the situation at hand and translate that into the ecosystem for the client or the ecosystem for the country?
Climate and sustainability, all businesses, in my opinion, need to have that front of the agenda. Where do you see the most obvious use cases, particularly in like goods businesses or resource-intensive organizations for, say, improvements in their sustainability agenda? What are the topics you're honing in on with executives?
So I would bifurcate it into kind of the financing topics and then the real world applications. So on the financing topics, what was delightful to see is, the conversation around climate and sustainability has really moved from, what should we do on climate and sustainability as, a green initiative and part of our ESG agenda, into like the core business models of financial services firms, which are how are we financing the transition and what does the business model of financing the transition look like off the back of that? And, some people say, oh, it's too much of a business-centric view and we shouldn't be making money off of the climate and sustainability agenda. But fundamentally, we live in a kind of capitalist world. The only way that the climate sustainability agenda is going to be fully embedded into kind of bank operations is if it has a functioning business model that sits behind it, right? So I was actually I'm happy to see that has been moved into more BAU, bank operations, and how do we now support the climate and sustainability agenda through a kind of standard business model. And that's good. And kind of financing the transition is definitely the language that people are using around that now. And I think that that's quite strong and will mean that kind of banks and others take that quite seriously. In terms of, corporate business models, fast-moving consumer goods, I think it's really focusing on kind of energy, where energy is derived from, which sources of energy, and then also longevity. So we focus a lot on, moving. I'll take automotive as an example. We focus a lot around moving to EVs, and people think that kind of buying an electric car is therefore green. You need to really consider the upfront carbon footprint of that car, right? Because if you're buying a X ton new EV and you're doing that every single 5 years, you're not green. I'm sorry, you're not. So what you need to be thinking about is the longevity of the assets that you hold. How are you thinking about building that into more of a circular economy repair? How are you focusing on kind of smaller automotive vehicles? Because the smaller the vehicle, the more green it is. But people who are buying the big EV SUVs every 3 or 4 years, I think we need to kind of refocus on what kind of actual green looks like in that agenda.
It's a misconception. And then on the sort of diversity point, I'm particularly interested in the point you made around socioeconomic diversity. How do we encourage that, particularly in the consulting world? Because we see it too. How do you change that though?
So you start upstream, as ever, with any of these things. So from an advisory perspective, one of the things that we did was we widened significantly the schools that we recruited from. So we used to have 2 core schools in the UK that we recruited from, and 90% of the individuals coming into the firm were from those schools, and even within those schools, it was within a small set of a small set of colleges and subjects. So the first thing is widen your aperture and understand that talent comes in many different shapes and forms. And once you've widened your aperture, though, you then need to look at the L&D programs that you have within the firm and how are they supporting people from diverse backgrounds. So what we did was we widened the aperture, then we brought in a bunch of different people and said, oh, actually, you don't fit exactly the mold that we designed for all of these other guys, so you should just actually leave the firm. This wasn't for you. And you can't do that. Obviously, you then need to adjust your L&D programs all the way through to make sure that you're accounting for the fact that you've just purposefully hired people from different backgrounds, and now you need to bring them through the firm as well. And you just need to be comfortable with the fact that diverse groups aren't always going to think in exactly the same way that you are. So if you grade them based on thinking in exactly the same way that you have, and you have performance evaluation systems that are set up to reward people that think in exactly the same way that you used to think, you're going to, again, have those individuals not be successful. So you need to think about it not just for the individual and getting that person in the door, but you need to think about the whole ecosystem that you have in advisory to make that person thrive.
How do you change that evaluation process? What, therefore, are the things that you think about when assessing a more diverse cohort?
So you think about, we basically went through and looked at our performance management system and said, is this, if we do an ex post evaluation, is this kind of supporting colleagues through? Or do we need to think about, additional training that needs to come in to provide, additional structuring or additional convergence or additional language or additional, what are the skills that are, need to be kind of rounded out through the different types of colleagues, and you just have to make it more adaptive. So you can no longer have, one narrow definition of success. You need to actually increase the kind of number of options and the number of paths that people can take, and you need to augment the scaffolding to support them.
I read you're involved outside of work in a number of charities as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I'm involved in a couple of charities, which I really enjoy. One is, the Green Hat, which is a charity that I sit on the board of. And it's really focused around helping people who have been excluded from the workforce come back in. So I think, much has been made around kind of people that are exiting the prison system that then kind of are excluded from the workforce, given some of the checks that are required. So how do you create apprenticeship roles to help those individuals back into the workforce? And one of the overarching kind of tenets of the charity is, teaching people to then have a sustainable kind of long-term career themselves. So how do you create kind of a multiple of the money that you're putting into the system to then support them on an ongoing basis? And that's one that I really, really enjoy. I also sit on the Leadership Council for National Numeracy, which is a phenomenal UK charity that is linked to the kind of numeracy agenda for the government. And the whole tenet of national numeracy is to help, again, the population, starting with, early primary school children, become more numerate. Because if you can't, undertake kind of the basic maths required for life, then you feel less confident in your day-to-day interactions, even, in your day-to-day kind of interactions with regular people. But equally, when you try to consume financial products, it can go horribly wrong. And people can end up in a very negative downward spiral because they didn't understand compound annual interest rates, or they didn't understand credit card debt, or they've gotten themselves into a payday loan that they couldn't pay back. And so for me, again, it's about helping people understand things so that they can be more productive and in society. And both of the charities are amazing, and they're run by insanely talented individuals who are just so deeply committed that, like, every single time I engage with them, I come away just very inspired.
Yeah, it sounds like amazing work. I'm really interested in this space. Thinking about that in the context of education, are there things, just based on what you just said around sort of numeracy and sort of life skills around sort of money, are there ways, if you could, you would change the sort of education system in the UK? What skills should we be teaching, maybe is a better way to put it, young people, what are they lacking?
So I would absolutely adjust the education system to be more real life practical, right? Especially as you think about the convergence of kind of AI into the economy. We don't need to understand kind of rote learning as much as we maybe had to in the past, where we needed to memorize things or we needed to have kind of access to the information in our brains. We have the ability to look things up online. What we need to understand now is, how do we think about maths in the context of, being able to balance your household checkbook, being able to kind of engage with your financial institution and consume products in a way that will help you and build credit for the long term. You need to be able to, feel confident in your interactions with the financial community. So I think it's building that kind of understanding of the application of the subjects as opposed to just a rote kind of learning of the subject and a memorization of the subject. I always feel very lucky. I grew up in Canada where we didn't have the standardized testing that we have here in the UK. You just went to school and you were graded by your teachers, and everyone trusts your teachers to give you the grades. And then you went to university based on like writing essays and why you wanted to go to that university. And so it was very different. But there was a big focus on group play and group interaction and group subjects. So you do a lot of group kind of problem solving. And in my undergraduate, we used the case study method as well, which again was reading an actual case from an actual company and then applying the skills and the techniques that you learned. And I just think it's that translation to academics the translation from academics to the real world that is unbelievably important. And the second thing, you mentioned vocational as well. Like, we need to create a much better acceptance that going to university isn't a superior path. Like, going to university is a path for a type of people, but there are incredibly rewarding careers that happen outside of individuals who went to university, and vocational skills, technical skills, we need to elevate those professions to the same level. And I think that in particular, one of the things I noticed that's different between Canada and the UK, which is just where I have most of the reference points, is there seems to be a much higher premium on going to university here and much less kind of elevation of other careers.
Definitely. Going back to the AI topic, we've spoken a lot about application in business. What about broader society? What will, for example, school children in 10 years' time, where will they notice the application of AI, or young people in 10 years' time? I mean, maybe self-driving cars. How do you think it's going to impact the everyday?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll be sad when we have self-driving cars because I genuinely love driving cars. But I think, so in education, it's a great example. So I think AI, if it's used well, will be used to personalize the learning agenda much more. And there's study after study after study that shows that personalized learning, particularly in primary school, has a significant impact on the individual's lifelong learning potential. So my kind of dream for that would be to have individualized AI providing a customized learning agenda for children, but to have the teacher then have much more space for the pastoral care that they need to give to those children as well. So when you talk about, how this will impact kind of teaching profession, there's absolutely no teacher that says, sweet, Gen AI is coming in and I'm going to the pub every day at 3, right? But there's lots of teachers that say, it would be amazing if I had an AI system that could observe what the child was doing and then automatically write up the report card, because I spend 20 hours doing report cards. And if I didn't have to spend those 20 hours doing report cards, I could do, more pastoral care for the children, or I could spend more time, helping them on areas where the AI couldn't. So in my kind of vision for the future, as you say, I would love to have, much more of that individualized, tailored learning for the children, and then have the teachers available for much more of that human intelligence pastoral care.
What are the barriers to the application of that, and how far away are we, do you think?
I mean, I think a few barriers, right? I mean, funding is obviously a barrier. And again, this is a difference between the UK and Canada, but I do genuinely worry about the capacity of state education to keep up with public education or private education. Yeah, exactly. And I worry that, technology will further exacerbate inequalities. Huge worry of mine. And so I think we need to really focus on the funding side of the equation and make sure that state schools are equipped with the technology that they need so that pupils there are not at a disadvantage. I think education policy needs to keep up. So we need to, reflect the fact that the velocity of change of these technologies is increasing and will continue to increase. And we need an adaptive policy framework that allows that to flow through to the education system so that we're not trailing 5-10 years behind. And then I think, the pupils I'm the least worried about, because they're going to be adaptive, but it's getting the system around them that enables them to thrive.
Are there similar opportunities in healthcare? So we're going around a bit. What do they look like?
Absolutely. I mean, healthcare, obviously the applications on the R&D side are massive, right? And particularly when you think about the unleashing of Gen AI, in particular on R&D, that has the ability to shave potentially months off, to increase the kind of probability and the odds of successful application, drug research. So if you can increase, the success rate of your research programs by 2, even 3%, like the ability then for that to create the capacity to fund new drugs is enormous. So, capacity creation by increasing the kind of success of R&D is one big area of application. Another is the more tailoring of individual treatments, right? So if you think about the way in which we're treated now, it's almost like blanket treatments for people of a general group. So like, you are a woman between the ages of 35 and 45 with this particular type of X, like therefore you receive Y. That's going to be kind of completely tailored now. So you'll have much more kind of tailored application of individual drugs to people. And then hopefully, again, it comes, this is where it intersects with policy and data privacy, but hopefully you can allow the Gen AI to then also take the data that comes out of the systems that we have to feed back through, what are the actual observed health outcomes? How did that then translate into the hospital treatment that they have, in addition to the medical treatment that they had? And how do you create kind of more of a learning ecosystem? But the latter is a little bit more difficult.
And same question, I suppose the two biggest barriers therefore, again, funding and I guess probably more so data privacy in healthcare.
Yeah, it's a little bit more, so governance, data privacy, both. I think, who owns and controls that data, and what do you do with individual data, and what are the rights of individual data, or what are the rights on usage for individual data versus collective data? One of the big things we're tackling as well is obviously cross-sectoral data use. Yes. So it's less, the use case hasn't been brought up for healthcare yet. It's more been brought up for kind of online versus financial decisioning. But you could draw you could draw a further parallel depending on how people were able to use the data. But essentially, right now we have an ecosystem where people are comfortable with their online data being used to show them online advertisements. Level of comfort TBD. Yeah. People are comfortable with their financial data being used to make financial decisions. But one of the use cases that comes up regularly is, but are you comfortable with your online data being used to make financial decisions? And like, what if in your profile you have people who are friends of somebody who was convicted, and therefore you have a lower financial score? And how does that cross-sectoral data work? Likewise, you could see an extreme version of this where you had a centralized database that included your health information. And would you be comfortable with somebody making a credit decisioning based on the fact that you had X disease or Y disease? And so I think we need to ex ante think about the implications of that, because if we design a system, once the data is there and the Gen AI has it, that's the end.
When people think about Gen AI and risks involved, a lot of people immediately go to the robots taking over. But to your mind, is this actually the biggest risk with Gen AI? And are there others?
I think this is one of the immediate risks. Yeah. I think, when people go to the robots taking over, it's kind of like almost like an extremist kind of future state. I think we need to think about the real materializing risks of how our data is being used. And, this is one risk, which is it's used in an inappropriate way. Another very real risk is the fact that the Gen AI is trained on historic decisions, right? And historically, people haven't always acted in the most ethical way. And, the most famous example of that is when they did the ex post review of Chicago judges. And so they ran AI over Chicago. They were using AI to predict the sentences for individuals that were coming up in the Chicago judicial system. And the Gen AI was predicting that Black men should receive 25% longer sentences than white men. And when they looked at that, they said, well, why is this happening? Well, it turns out Chicago judges had historically sentenced Black men to 25% longer sentences. So we need to, and this comes back to the conversation we were having earlier, you need to challenge the AI, and you need to do all of these ex post risk assessments and checks to make sure that the decisions that the AI is making are actually right and fair, and that they're not based on historical decision facts that were, from a decision kind of group that was unfair.
And who's accountable for that?
The companies that use AI and the governments that use AI are 100% accountable, and they need to have the appropriate second line defense and risk oversight to make sure that they are accountable for that. And I think this is where financial services firms are doing a lot right, because they have a classic 3-line of defense structure, and they're building AI risk into that structure, or have built AI risk into that structure where they're already using it. And I think that's exactly right. And you need to do that ex post testing. Like, you can't be reliant on it to just say, this is the right decision because it's what the AI has said.
in other industries, but there's still a long way to go. And so I guess big tech, not there yet.
Well, big tech's in a different position because they've largely been unregulated, right? So outside of kind of particular parameters or kind of general competition regulation, they haven't had sectoral regulation in the same way that energy companies or financial services companies have. I think they're very much starting on this journey. And I would say the last 2 or 3 years, they've accelerated quite quickly. You've seen some of the largest tech firms put, chief risk officers in place. They are, not to the point yet where they have, as belts and braces of a 3-line of defense model, and they may not go down that direction depending on the rules that they have and the kind of regulators that they face into. But I think when you speak to big tech and when you look at the ethics committees that they have set up, they are certainly look like they are putting in many of the structures that you would have in place to oversee this. But the problem is that the technology will continue to advance, right? So we need to operate in a society where we can put the right guardrails around that to make sure citizens are protected. Because whilst large tech companies may be doing this, right, you simply won't have the capacity or necessarily the kind of will in all of them.
What impact do you hope to achieve by the end of your career?
What I hope to achieve by the end of my career is to have kind of the tenets of things that I valued live on in the people that are continuing their careers and moving into like the peaks of their career. So one of the things that I like about advisory is that, I'm working with an incredibly talented team. So I don't expect to finish any of the things that I care about in the course of my career. So I think what I'd love at the end of my career is to be able to see that being taken forward by individuals that I really kind of love and respect.
What are those things?
So one of the biggest things that I'm passionate about is kind of regulatory reform. I know it makes me unbelievably exciting at your dinner party. But I think that regulation, if it is used correctly, enables strong and efficient and safe growth, right? And I think we currently have a regulatory system that was designed for an industrial world.
Yes.
And we can use some of these catalytic moments right now around the introduction of new technologies to change the regulatory architecture so that it looks less at kind of sectoral harms in financial services or energy or in telco, and much more about the harms to the end consumer. And so thinking about how we would reorient the regulatory framework so that it's much more looking cross-sectoral for what are the harms that could potentially manifest for you or for me, and how do we regulate that in an efficient way with, effective touch points between the regulated entities and the regulators themselves? How are we sharing a lot more data between the regulators, but also between the regulated entities? And then how do we then use that information on a feedback loop to help the startup community, help the scale-up community, and to ultimately create like a much more vibrant and productive economy? So you could do it here in the UK, and then you think about how that manifests on an international level. But that is like the thing I'm most excited about. And I know it's super nerdy, but I just love it. And I do a lot of work in that space. And so we won't necessarily solve all of that. Like I think we can solve good chunks of it, and we're in flight on solving kind of a lot of that at the moment. But that's something that kind of needs to be taken forward. And like it's totally overused word, but that needs to be an agile and an adaptive system. And particularly because some of the new technologies are changing so quickly, like designing a framework that kind of keeps up with that would be my dream.
I'm really interested in it too. I'm going to ask you another question about it. What are the other really like low-hanging pieces of it? Where can most gains be made with better regulatory framework?
So not surprisingly, they kind of all center around technology because that's what's driving disruption in the industry. But you've got health tech, you've got green tech, you've got fintech, you've got med tech, biotech. So that will all have a slightly sectoral bent on it. But what I think a kind of a strong principles-based regulatory system can do is help us break the back of the fact that we have an amazing startup community in this country, but we fall down on scale-ups, right? And many of the scale-ups, even if they do manage to scale up in the UK, then go list in the US. Yes. And I think if we can help orient the regulatory framework that enables companies to kind of move through that, that would be one of the biggest things we can do for productivity and effectiveness in the UK.
Is there anything else that you could see continuing after you?
We do a lot around digitalization of government, and I think continuing to make kind of a personalized digital interface between you and the government such that your data is available and accessible within the parameters that you set across agencies, that you continue to have, an increasingly efficient engagement with government. I think particularly important for people who rely on the government for money on a periodic basis. So how do we make sure that they're able to get that in the most seamless way with the least amount of time that it takes for them? And how also are you kind of designing that intelligent framework to then be able to help support people back into the workforce, and what kind of technologies can you use to make that more effective, and how can you actually support kind of individuals back in. And that's another one where I just don't think we're ever going to be done on digitalization of government, because it's always something that's going to be kind of adaptive and changing. Exactly.
Last question. What does the future hold for you?
Future for me, I purposefully take like a couple of days where I have absolutely nothing every December, and it's one of my favorite things that I do every year. And I think about, what did I like in the last 12 months? What do I want in the next 12 months? What do I want in the next 3, 5, 10 years? And when I was doing that this year, I was, reflecting on the fact that it was my first year as market leader, and there's a lot of things that I liked and a lot of things that I found more difficult. But one of the things that I really enjoyed was leading a kind of a bigger, more diverse team that was doing that wasn't just in my classic advisory role, but actually got much more exposure to running of the company. And I think that type of leadership role with a more operational side is definitely something that I want to continue to explore in my career, either at Oliver Wyman or kind of wherever my career takes me from here. Right now, I'm just enjoying the current role, so don't plan on going anywhere yet, but that's kind of where I'm kind of heading.
Thank you.